Welcome to class. This is one of a series of video lectures that I'm putting together for social psychology. And if you are actually enrolled in my class, then these lectures are going to be put into sequence in Canvas, along with readings and other materials for the coursework for the class that you're enrolled in. And if you just happen to be stumbling on this video over YouTube, that's perfectly fine. But be aware that they're not in sequence on my YouTube page. In this particular lecture, what I'm going to be talking about is some aspects of social influence that stem from early research by Muzafer, Sherif and Solomon Asch. What I'd like you to do to begin is first consider the last presidential election. And whoever you voted for, if you voted for Clinton or if you voted for Trump, it doesn't matter. But whoever you voted for, write down one positive thing about the opposing candidate. And if you didn't vote, then write down one positive thing about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. So the assumption here is that you don't really have any positive thoughts about the opposition candidate, and I'm asking you to just take a moment and think of some positive aspect of that opposition candidate, or if you didn't vote at all and you're not interested in politics, about Kim Jong-un, who I think it's safe to assume that most Americans don't have very positive attitudes about North Korea's leader. So now that you have that cognition in mind, that positive thought about the opposition candidate, were you persuaded to actually believe the thing that you wrote down? You're probably thinking no. And if I were doing this in an actual class meeting in person, I can ask people what they thought and whether or not they were persuaded. And typically the answer is of course not, because you were simply asked to write down this thing that you didn't believe. Nobody's going to be persuaded by something like that. What this illustrates is compliance. You complied with the request to do something, but mere compliance does not result in inner acceptance of the new belief. I mean, it's not even a belief at that stage. So for the next exercise, recall 2 episodes in which you conformed to a group, where you were in a group and you conformed to the opinion of the group. It shouldn't be too hard to think about some time in which you were in a group. Perhaps it was your family, or perhaps it was a party, any type of a social group, and where you either had a strong feeling about something and caved in, or you didn't have a very strong feeling about whatever was being talked about and you just went along with the group. So in either case, that would be an instance of conformity where you go along with the group. Now that you have something in mind, hopefully just take a moment and think of something like that. Is the act of conforming that you're thinking of, that you actually did, that you engaged in, is that act of conforming a positive or negative thing in your experience? And again, if we were doing this in an actual classroom, this would be a nice discussion point. So what we're doing here is I'm asking you to just think about that, to take a second and think about whether or not you think it was a positive thing or a negative thing or a completely neutral thing. And if you didn't have strong feelings about whatever the group was doing, then it's probably going to be pretty neutral. It could have been something like you conformed to the choice of a restaurant that you wanted to go to. So now moving beyond the personal experiences that you might have, think of 3 episodes where conformity can be positive. Let's take a moment before I move to the next image, the next slide. Take a moment and think of 3 episodes where conformity can be positive. It might be hard for you to think of such a list. I mean, it's a short list, but it might be difficult for you to think of 3 episodes where conformity is something that's seen as being positive. And I think the reason for that is that, at least in the United States, we tend to think of conformity as being a negative attribute. That we like rugged individualism. We don't particularly like people who conform. But there are plenty of instances in which conformity is a good thing. And so I've got this little short list of positive instances of conformity. Holidays with the family, where you might go along and do things that you're not particularly interested in doing. Why? Because you want to have a good experience with your family. So the experiential component of being with your family and having a good time with your family is more important than whatever it is that the family might want to do that you're not particularly interested in doing. Or how about behaving well at restaurants? We we have norms for things like dining at restaurants, and those norms may not fit what we actually want to do at that particular moment, so that's a type of conformity. And you can see that that would be a very beneficial thing for all of us. If the people around you in a restaurant behave badly, then it ruins your experience. And similarly, if you're the person behaving badly, then everybody gets upset at you, and that's not a very good experience either. So in that sense, then, conformity with this group norm is positive both for the actor and the observers at the restaurant. Another one would be singing songs at sporting events, the seventh inning stretch at a baseball game. Everybody stands and sings, and fans of particular teams, no matter what sport it is, they have chants and songs that they sing in support of their teams. Being friendly with strangers when meeting new people. You may not be in a good mood, but you conform to, again, the group norms that indicate how you should behave when you're meeting strangers or learning customs in a new country. Now, there can be negative aspects to conformity, but we tend to ignore the positives and focus on the negatives. And it probably is easier for people to think about the negative aspects of conformity than the positive ones, because we, to some extent, take the positive aspects of conformity for granted. And whenever people think of the negative aspects of conformity, it's really easy to come up with examples like cult indoctrination. We can likely all agree that there's a positive side and a negative side to conformity, but in terms of the actual research that's been done on conformity, I think it's also fair to say that the research itself focuses on negative aspects of conformity. And that's certainly true of the research that's first half of the 20th century. One researcher stands out in this area, and that's Muzafer Sherif. Sherif was one of the most famous early social psychologists based on the research that he did in the 1930s and then other research in the 1950s. And what I'd like to do here is talk about his 1930s research that formed the basis of his doctoral dissertation at Columbia University. Sherif was originally born in 1906 in Turkey. When he was about 13 or 14, in 1919, Greek soldiers invaded the part of Turkey where he lived because they were having a border dispute about the ownership of that territory, that part of Turkey. In his telling of it, the Greek soldiers were committing atrocities. They were murdering civilians, and there was one particular soldier that was bayoneting people left and right. After bayoneting an adult male standing next to Sherif, Sherif thought that he would be next to die. But the soldier spared him, apparently because of his young age. And again, in Sherif's telling, Sherif was amazed to be alive after that. Well, he survived. He went to college, and from 1924 to 1929 approximately, studied as an undergraduate and then getting a master's degree, both of which occurred in Turkey. In 1929, he earned a scholarship to Harvard University to study abroad. And he got to the United States a month before the great stock market crash of 1929. So he saw the economy booming in the United States, and then the impact that the stock market crash had, which formed his interest in politics and unionization and labor movements, which he studied while he was at Harvard from 1929 to 1932. And this is before he finished his doctoral dissertation, so that doesn't happen until 1935. From 33 to 34, he leaves the United States temporarily to teach in Berlin. And it's while he's in Berlin that Sherif becomes interested in propaganda, because that coincided that the year 1933 is the year that the Nazi Party took power in Germany. And it's that period of time in which the Nazi Party was consolidating their power base. Originally, the Nazis were not very popular, politically speaking, in Germany. And after they gained power in the government, the Nazi Party needed to persuade the ordinary people of Germany to follow their political platform. And so what you see in Germany during that period of time is the widespread use of political propaganda posters. Now, there's no social media at that time, of course. There was radio, but in order to reach the masses, what the propagandists did is they created posters, and those posters had slogans on them, similar to what we might think of as memes today. The slogans have to be catchy, they have to be brief, and they have to tell a message that orients the person to the reality that you want them to believe. Again, just like memes operate today, memes definitely are propaganda. And some are just funny, like the cat meme, the famous cat meme. But very often memes are created in order to give a particular political angle, a particular lens on an issue that the person who's sharing the meme wants you to see it in that perspective. And that's what propaganda is all about. That's what these posters that Sherif noted being plastered all around Berlin, that's what those posters were about. He returns to the United States in 1935 before World War II starts, and he finishes his dissertation at Columbia University. I'll talk about that dissertation in a minute. In 1936, he publishes a text titled The Psychology of Social Norms. Then he moves from New York City to teach in Paris for a brief period of time. 1937, he returns to Turkey. And in 1943, I'm estimating that because the information that I have available is not quite perfectly clear as to the year that he was arrested, but I think it's about 1943. He was arrested by the government of Turkey for anti-Nazi statements because the Turkish government was sympathetic to the Nazis during World War II. And so they arrested Sherif, and they were going to keep him in prison for many years. They were going to sentence him to a very lengthy period of time. But there was pressure from Harvard University to release Sherif, of course, because Sherif was an alumni of Harvard. After he's released, he returns to the United States. And these different experiences that he had in his early days fostered an interest in trying to promote peaceful negotiations between countries. And he spent a good part of his later years working on projects on that front. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to focus on his 1935 autokinetic effects studies. Now, to follow the logic of Sherif's 1935 research, it's important to understand the impact that these posters had that Sherif would have seen in Berlin in 1933 and 34. Here's an example of a poster. Now, of course, we cannot know if Sherif actually saw this particular poster, but this is sort of typical of the posters that were being put up on walls around Berlin at that time. The original poster would have been about 4 feet tall, and the translated text says, "Through faith in Germany, we will master destiny." And here's another poster from 1935. So this was after Sherif had already left. But again, these are typical. This style of poster is typical of what was being used from 1933 on. So Sherif would have seen similar posters, if not this particular one. This one shows a couple of adolescents in the Hitler Youth driving out enemies of the Nazi government. It says, with all the peace of mind, unity of youth, and Hitler Youth. And the enemies of the state, in this case, are Catholics that are being driven out. Not all the posters were anti-Semitic. The Nazis had a variety of enemies. Here's one that's anti-communist. It says communism destroys the family. I think this one illustrates nicely the fact that when you have a slogan, you want it to be short and pithy. You want it to be direct and to the point, something that is a statement that you cannot argue with. In order to be effective, a social media meme or a piece of propaganda has to claim to have the truth and state it in such a way that arguing about whether it does or doesn't just it's irrelevant. There's no seeking of evidence here whatsoever. This poster I particularly like from a propaganda perspective. And I say that in the sense that I think it was probably a very effective poster. The text in translation says, "All Germany listens to the Führer with the People's Radio." And I had to spend a little bit of time in terms of the translation on that one, because the second half of that word at the bottom, the Empfänger, that also means receiver. But I think in this context it translates better into the People's Radio. And one reason I think that this poster was probably particularly effective is the fact that you've got this image of tens of thousands of people surrounding this radio, which is not the state's radio, it's the people's radio, according to the text anyway. And people are avidly listening to the communication on there. As a social psychologist, I find this fascinating, because the tendency of a person viewing this would be to think to themselves, well, what is it that's being said, and should I be listening to? If everyone else is doing it, so should I. And so there's a clear conformity element to this particular propaganda poster that if everyone else is doing it, then probably I should be doing it as well. This next poster links the anti-Semitic along with the anti-Bolshevik or anti-communist theme. Now, not all of the posters were anti-Semitic, and I think when you review the posters that are in collections today, that some museums have collections of these Nazi propaganda posters, you'll find that many of them are not anti-Semitic, that they have other purposes, and I suspect that the reason why is because the German population at that point in time in the 1930s was already very strongly anti-Semitic, so they did not need to persuade people to become anti-Semitic. But this poster has a particular purpose in mind in terms of linking the communist state, you see the hammer and sickle on the right-hand side of the poster, with the Jewish individual who's holding money. And so apparently the purpose of this one is to suggest that there's a communist conspiracy that's being employed throughout Germany by means of Jewish individuals. Here's what Sherif had to say about these slogans that were in the posters, and why he began studying this particular topic. And this is a quote from his interview. "Slogans are norms, that is, slogans are shortcut formulas for epitomizing predicaments people are in and what is to be done. You see it in every social movement. The American Revolution had life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the French Revolution had liberty, equality, and fraternity. The slogan is an anchor to hold on to. In this way, slogans help change attitudes and create new social norms. When I understood this, I decided to get to the bottom of it. That was my doctoral thesis. So Sherif returns to Columbia University from Germany with the intent to study slogans, but you can't just study a slogan in the lab and see what impact it has on people's attitudes, particularly if you use these German slogans with American students. It might have the opposite effect. So what he did is he devised the system to study an ambiguous stimulus in the laboratory and see if other people's opinions, which operate in the same sense as a slogan would in a propaganda message, whether other people's opinions would have an impact on how each individual subject thinks that an ambiguous stimulus is changing over time. Here's a diagram that was used in Sherif's doctoral dissertation and published in his 1936 book, The Psychology of Social Norms. On the left-hand side, you see these small squares with an S in it. That's for subject. And so there are 3 chairs. Each one of these represents a chair where a subject is seated. In front of the 3 chairs is a table. So you have the letter K, and when you read the legend on the side, it says that K is the reaction key. So the 3 different reaction measurement devices, one in front of each chair, and they're large enough and the people are seated close enough so that each person at that table is able to observe what the other people are doing with their reaction keys. The main thing to understand here is that these are knobs or levers where people are recording how much they think that something is moving. And the amount of the change in the apparatus is visible to each person at the table. So that if the person on your left or the person on your right is moving that dial a lot, you can see it. You can see how much they're moving, and you get the full idea. It's very clear. It's not ambiguous at all. It's very clear in terms of how much that neighbor of yours thinks that something is changing. Now, what is that something? On the right-hand side of the room, on the right-hand side of the visual here, and remember this is an overhead diagram of a room, we see that there's a light source. Now that thing in the table on the right-hand side, there's several different pieces of equipment here, but most importantly there's a projector that's projecting a dot of light against the thing in the middle. MS is the screen. It's a movable screen. So MS stands for a movable screen. And it looks like it's arrayed in such a way that it's sort of all over the place. It looks like a gigantic letter M. I assume that the screen itself is flat, and at any rate, the people at the other end on the left-hand side of the room would not be able to see what looked like a screen because the entire right-hand side of the room is completely darkened. There's a little chair on the right, a little square that represents a chair. That's where the experimenter sits. And after the subjects are brought into the room, the experiment starts. Again, the right-hand side of the room is completely dark, so that you can't see a thing. You can't even see that there's a screen. Apparently, it's that amount of darkness. There's only sufficient light at the table on the left-hand side so that you can see the other apparatuses and the neighbors sitting next to you. But you can't see anything else. It's a very dim light. So now we have a small dot of light that's being shot out from the device on the right-hand side of the room against the screen that's in the middle of the room. And when you have a dot of light in the middle of darkness with no reference point, it appears as if it's moving. It appears as if that dot of light is drifting slowly in space. You can see this on your own if you, under the right conditions, look at the night sky. If there are no other reference points and all you can see is perhaps one bright planet, like Venus, if there's no other reference point in the sky at that point in time, it'll look like it's moving a little bit. It's difficult to do that when it's still light out, because when it's light you can see other things. So it has to be a specific condition where you're not able to see any other dot of light or any other visual perceptual stimuli. And if you do have one dot of light in the middle of all that darkness, it will appear to be moving. And that's the autokinetic effect. So the subjects are brought into the lab. Each person is sat down at the chair, and after everything is set up, then the light is shown against the screen, and the subjects are asked to record on the devices on the table in front of them how much that dot of light is moving. Now, there's no discussion between the subjects, but the subjects can see what each other subject is doing. Okay, so let's move on to the data, the actual results. And here we have a set of graphs that were produced by Sherif, and these were presented in his dissertation in 1935 and published in the book that he put out in 1936. We've got two columns, a left-hand column and a right-hand column, and there's an important difference between the two columns. The column on the left involves people coming into the lab one at a time, giving an estimate of the amount of movement of the light, and then the second person joins the table. And that second person also has had an opportunity independently to judge the amount of movement of light. So the first trial, the different recordings here in the first graph, the different vertical lines are for 4 different trials. This will make sense in a better way when I give a close-up. But for now, let me just talk about the differences in the independent variable. So the left-hand side, again, has people entering the laboratory room and independently of one another giving an estimate of the amount of movement of light, and then they have a group estimate. Whereas the right-hand column has people joining together and giving a group estimate at the beginning and then individual estimates at the end. Okay, so now let me give you a close-up of that graph that's on the top left-hand side. Here's the close-up, and I put the session number at the bottom so that it's easier to read. So the way that we interpret this is that the different lines going across are 2 different subjects, and at session 1, at test session 1, that's when you have individual ratings where the people in the study, the 2 subjects, are not aware of the other subjects and their ratings. So these are independent ratings, independent of the social influence of the other person. So test session 1, subject 1 is saying that the light is moving about 3.5 inches, whereas subject number 2 is saying that it's moving about 1/2 inch. At test session 2, subject number 1 has changed and now is estimating that the dot of light is moving a little bit more than 4 inches. And subject number 2 in session 2 has changed a lot. So you see that that person has come up substantially and is now estimating that the dot of light is moving about 3.25 inches. Now it's important to remember the dot of light is not moving. It's an optical illusion. It only appears to be moving, but in reality it's totally stable. In session 3, subject number 1 is now saying that the dot of light moves about 5.5 inches, whereas subject 2 is stable at 3.5 inches. And then at session 4, they seem to have converged. Now I'll go on to another pair of data, a different graph from the set of graphs. This is the second graph in column, in the left-hand column of the main page. Two different people. Again, the session 1, you have independent ratings. Subject number 1 in session 1 is estimating that the light moves almost 10 inches, so that's quite a lot. Whereas subject number 2 in session number 1 is saying that the light moves 3 inches. And then at the second test session, where they're sitting next to each other, their estimates have converged substantially. And test session 3 and session 4, they're still sitting next to each other at different trials. They're estimating the amount of light. And you see that the answers that they give are now almost uniform. They're almost the same. And that's what Sherif considered to be conformity. That the person next to you is influencing how you think the dot of light is moving. Here's another page from Sherif's set of results, and this one is for 3-person situations. The previous data were for 2-person situations. This one has 3 subjects per trial. And it's the same layout, with the left-hand column having individual ratings first, whereas the right-hand column has group ratings first, and the very last one is individual ratings. I'm only really interested in the left-hand column. So let me give you a close-up of that first graph on the left-hand column. Here's the close-up. And now with the test sessions more clearly articulated, more clearly enumerated, we can see that with these 3 different subjects, there's a lot of variability. Subject number 1, the solid line, is saying that it moves about 7.5 inches. And again, this first session is individual ratings which are independent of the other people. So they don't get the chance to see what the other people are doing. Subject number 2 is saying that it's moving about 2 inches. And subject number 1 is saying that it's moving a little bit less than 1 inch. At test session 2, these 3 people are now seated next to each other. Each person at that table is able to see what the other people are doing in terms of their ratings. And you see that there's a dramatic confluence, a dramatic change in the estimates of light, so that the first person who originally said 7.5 inches is now saying 4. And similarly, the other 2 people come up. Test session 3, it's about the same, and by test session 4, they're saying that the light is moving about the same amount. They're in total agreement. So this is, according to Sherif, this is the conformity effect, where you have a mutually agreed upon reality that people are using information from the social environment in order to interpret what's going on. Now, when you compare that to those propaganda posters, if you are in fact in a state of, let's say, you don't really know how to interpret the political sphere in the country that you're living in, and you're being constantly bombarded with these propaganda messages that lay out a particular theme that's easy to understand, and if you think that everybody else agrees with that theme, then you may be likely to change your attitude to suit that. At least that was Sherif's interpretation of the results. Here's another one where you see the similar pattern. Now, it's important to know that he didn't find this in every group. He did not find the same exact pattern in every group. Some of these were more successful than others, but this is the one that gets reprinted in textbooks all over the place. That is to say, in discussions about the Sherif research, people often do not look at all the individual graphs, but they only look at the one that worked the best, which is sort of cherry-picking the data. Sherif's series of experiments were successful, but it should be tempered. That success should be tempered with the fact that not all of the groups were equally clear in terms of a conformity effect. In conclusion, what Sherif's 1935 research shows us is that information from our social environments can have a direct impact on how we perceive information from our environments. The dot of light was not moving, and yet the information from each participant's neighbor who was sitting next to them had an impact on how the different participants felt that the dot of light was moving. They were conforming to a group norm when there was no reality to conform to. In fact, the light was not moving at all. And yet they developed their own reality as the experiment went on. One of the more interesting things that Sherif did is he started to take the participants who had formed a reality of a large amount of movement of the dot of light, and one by one he would replace those participants with a naive new participant who would very quickly adopt that group norm of the amount of light movement that was being observed, until the point where he got rid of all of the original participants and replaced them all with new participants, and those new participants still maintain that group norm. And so this is a really nice way to show that group norms are consensually created and consensually validated by people who are using information from their social environment. And because of that, because it's the information that's being used, this type of social influence is often called informational influence. And so I'll refer to informational influence again in the next video that I create.